personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a very special guest on the show, all the way from Dublin. This is Dr. Valerie Lyons. She is the Chief Operating Officer of BH Consulting. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be on your show.
Yeah, I'm very happy to have you on the show. So we know each other via LinkedIn. Actually, you and Todd asked me to collaborate with you on a book that has come out. I actually got it in the mail recently. It's really good. It's called The Privacy Leader Compass. It's a very popular book. But in addition to the book, I want you to tell a little bit about your background and your trajectory into privacy and what really got you interested in it.
Thanks for that introduction, Debbie. So what got me into privacy? Well, I suppose I have been in cybersecurity for very much the first part of my career. I wasn't a very good programmer, and so that led me to fall into systems admin, which eventually led to cybersecurity and security admin and security leadership. So I was the CISO in KBC Bank for about just under 15 years, which is a long time to be in a CISO role. And then I decided that I wanted to do a PhD. And I spoke to a professor in Trinity College, which is where my undergrad was from. And he said I should look to my past and then look to the future and let the PhD be the funnel between the two. So I decided that I liked privacy and I wanted to do a little bit of work on privacy. And I thought that privacy was the future because GDPR was 2016. GDPR was all the talk and all the rage in 2016. So I did a PhD, or I started a PhD in information privacy in Dublin City University at that time. And that morphed into a PhD in privacy as an ESG and privacy as a CSR, which was really, really topical by the time I completed the PhD. So my research primarily focuses on what is the value of privacy as an ESG. So what things can an organization do that get them the most bang for their buck in terms of privacy as an ESG or a CSR. So that was kind of where I came to be, as in during that time, then separate to my PhD, I also moved roles and I moved into BH Consulting. At the time, there was no consulting department or team for privacy. It was a very new thing that established after 2016 in Europe, that we started to get demand for DPO as a service and CPO as a service. So essentially, we set up that team and I led that team until the team became too big and I became COO then about 3 years ago in BH Consulting. So we now have two teams, one in data protection and one in cybersecurity. And then for myself, what brought me, I suppose, to writing the book was the PhD was now completed. And I'd always wanted to write the book. I knew I had gleaned so much information over the past 7 to 8 years. And in fact, it was the guts of 10 that I'd been working in privacy at that point, that I wanted to distill it down so that other CPOs and DPOs could kind of leverage that information that I gained over the previous decade. So that's how I got to be sort of where I am today. I always say that my passion is privacy and what I did for a living was cybersecurity. Whereas now I feel like I found my tribe, if that's the right word.
That's tremendous. Thank you so much for sharing that. So you have this background in cyber, this deep interest and background in privacy, and then ESG. I love the way that you connect that together because a lot of people, I don't think, see that connection. Let's talk a little bit about the connections. I think when people talk about ESG, they think about other societal issues. They don't really think about privacy as a societal issue or ill that you need to really think about. But tell me about how those two connect.
So the ESG is three dimensions. There's the environmental, the social, and the governance. So everybody thinks about privacy as a governance issue, though. So the G is well established. The E, which is the environmental piece, really there's pretty much zero link. I've seen some tenuous stretches where people have started to link encryption in data privacy with the E. How much carbon footprint does that generate and things like that? But I really think it's a bit of a tenuous link. I've seen better, more recent links on the E side. So within that dimension, the environmental dimension, which is the whole working from home is enabled by privacy professionals. We enable that to happen securely, safely, together with the cybersecurity people. But the two are working hand in hand to make that happen properly. And so, what carbon footprint are we saving? And that could be a good one for E, is that by allowing remote working, are you reducing the carbon footprint of your organization that could be attributed to an E? Again, I don't think it's very robust, but the S, the social element, absolutely is. So we see the social element being promoted through what are corporate social responsibility reports. That's the best insight we get into the S piece. Now, ESG is typically quantitative, and CSR, the S piece, is typically qualitative. We're seeing those merge where you're getting quantitative and qualitative results put together. More often than not, and this is where, Debbie, the thing that you were saying about people referring to ESG and privacy, it's a new thing. More often than not, when they're referring to it, they're talking about governance window dressed as the S piece, but actually the S piece is far more than governance. So I've analyzed in my research over the years multiple CSO reports, and typically what the CSO reports contain is greenwashed compliance. So saying things like all our people have been trained in privacy awareness training, but GDPR says they have to do that anyway. So it's marketing spin on what is compliance. But many of the large tech organizations actually do S, more real S, real social contribution from a privacy perspective. So we see them doing things like Cisco, for instance. We see Cisco writing amicus briefs, fighting governments against privacy legislation that isn't robust enough for the consumer. We see Microsoft, for instance, saying that they're implementing privacy awareness training across all the organization, regardless of the requirement to do so, and implementing GDPR levels of data protection, regardless of the requirement to do so. Now, the cynical me could argue that, well, actually, it might be easier to do that than comply with a whole panoply of legislations from around the world. But at the same time, it's something they don't have to do. We also see conferences being run by organizations. We see organizations pulling together privacy standards and AI governance standards now. We see filtering into that for the public to use. We see white papers. These are all social pieces of privacy that we are truly social, that they are beneficial to the public. The reasons why organizations do this, there's multiple reasons. And obviously, much of it is about consumer trust. So I don't really care what the motivation for the organization is to do the S piece, to actually do privacy as a CSR. I kind of see it as a means to an end. I like the end. The end is that we get better privacy. But the means to it and the motivation factors that they have towards getting that is most likely increased reputation, sales, all those kind of elements. It doesn't matter to me as long as the end product is more robust privacy.
I agree that, right, you want the benefits, right, of the actions that people take, and it may not necessarily be important. To me, I agree with you. Well, why they do it, that's great that they do it. As you were talking about the S in ESG, it occurred to me that part of the S could be ethics. And I just want your thoughts there, because I feel like when a lot of people talk about privacy, they only think about the legal aspect. So it's like, okay, we're not going to do anything until there's a law passed, and then we're going to put all these programs in place. But there's more to privacy than compliance or regulatory elements. And to me, outside of that can be ethics, right? why you do what you do. Why do you care about the individual? Are you thinking about the harms that could be done with that person? As you were talking, I'm thinking, no, maybe that's where ethics goes. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
You're absolutely right, Debbie. Ethics does, to some degree, fit into the S piece. If we look at the definition of CSR, CSR is considered to be all those activities that an organization undertakes that exceed, so there's two qualifications that exceed regulation. They don't have to do it and contribute to society in some shape or form. So there's the two elements have to be met because you can do something that exceeds regulation, but it's not CSR if it doesn't contribute to society in some way. Now, society can be the consumer. It doesn't have to be like the world or global world in general. It can be just as simple as the consumer or the shareholders, the wider stakeholder community. So it can even be governments and policymakers. So it's just wider society. Ethics, if we think about Buttarelli said that no legislation, GDPR in particular, can be effective if we don't adhere to the spirit of the law, not just the letter of the law. That piece is ethic. Ethics is also, as you say, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's in that space of just because you can doesn't mean you should. In other words, we're going to look at the potential harms that can be caused by the activities that we undertake, and we're going to avoid those potential harms. That is definitely CSR. So I can, give you examples of CSR where organizations are trying to avoid those harms. Tencent, for instance, in China, it creates games and it embedded an ability within its games to not have addiction. You can create a 4 hour pause within it so that it actually doesn't work for the rest of the day. The idea of that was so that your child wouldn't become addicted to it. So they're building that in, but they're disconnecting from them getting more use out of you because they know that it's better to not do harm. And so we see this element of avoiding harm, but it's very hard to say it's ethical when you have a piece of legislation like the Digital Service Act now coming at you, and that tells you actually there's a code that says you need to do no harm. So we see ethics being a fluid thing that sometimes it sits in the ethics space. So sometimes these activities sit in ethics. Sometimes they don't because they sit in governance in some jurisdictions. So the do no harm piece is actually coming through in Europe through the Digital Service Act. And in other jurisdictions, we might see it more as a CSR element because there is not yet that set of similar regulations. So the ethics piece can be sometimes in the CSR space and sometimes in the G space if it's moved into a regulation.
I agree. I love this. I love to talk with people who have dealt with these issues on a deep level, as you have in your research and your work, because you can explain, just as you had just done, in a very deep way, in a very explainable way, why these concepts are important and how they apply to people. Let's talk a little bit about the book, The Privacy Leader Compass. So it's a comprehensive business-oriented roadmap for building and leading practical privacy teams. And so it includes insights from 60 plus top privacy experts and privacy leaders. You all were gracious enough to ask me to contribute to the book. The book is very good. And I'm not saying that just because I'm in it. But the thing I like about this book, and I read lots, I see lots of privacy books. So everyone sends me their privacy books so I can read it. But the thing that I think is really unique about this book is the way that it is structured, where it has a lot of practical tips and takeaways that people can use right now in their job, whether they're on the legal side, whether they're on the data side. Tell me about just the structure of the book and how you mean for people to be able to consume it and use it in their work.
So you're absolutely right, actually. I think the structure is something that's unique to the book. When we looked originally at writing a book, I always consider myself a bit of a hybrid. So I looked to the literature that was out there, and I found it a bit jumpy and I didn't find it structured enough for me, for the way I think and the way I need to see things sort of presented to me, just in terms of how my brain works. And so academics, when they encounter that, they tend to look to find a structure in another field and use that structure in another field. And essentially, that's what we did. We took the 7S model, which is a model from McKenzie that was used for organizational effectiveness. And so we looked at the privacy team and the privacy program as an organization. And to make it effective, we use this 7S model. So the 7S's, they can apply to any type of organization. So in its strategy, which obviously applies to privacy because you have a privacy strategy, and particularly in large organizations, got your structure. Obviously, you're going to have a privacy structure. Is it going to be top down? Is it going to be bottom up? Are you going to have a DPO? Are you going to have CPOs? So that structure, you got systems, that is the frameworks that you're going to use to structure your privacy program. You've got style, that's your leadership style. Because if you're leading a team, what style do you have and what implications does that style have? You've got staff. So how are you going to manage the privacy team? In the book, we use Belbin's team roles because it's a particular favorite of mine. My master's is in leadership, so I kind of leverage the key things I picked up during my master's that I've applied in my workspace. And then we have skills. What skills do you need? You can find a thousand skills for DPOs and CPOs on the internet, and they're usually all related to the knowledge that they have to have. But that's not what I focus on in the book. What I focus on in the book is the soft skills that you need to lead a team of people. And those people are privacy people typically. So it's the skills that you need to lead those people. And then shared values are the laws that we have to understand that skill set obviously is important to understand the laws and the jurisdictions that your business is operating in, but also the ethics piece. So I cover ethics and ESG hugely in that chapter because it's so important in my view, and obviously in yours.
That's tremendous. Thank you so much for that. I highly recommend the book. This is one of those books that you just have to keep around because there's always going to be a nugget of something in here that you may need, that may be something that you aren't thinking about, that you need to consider, that you can go back to time and time again. I think that's really great. One thing that you said that I want to expand upon is around soft skills. So a lot of times, and I get this question all the time from people, like, how do I get into privacy? How do I improve my skills? How do I get traction within organizations? And this is an example I've actually heard people say, and it does not work, right? So if you are a privacy person and you come into a meeting and you're like, I'm in charge here and I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, like you're just not going to be successful in that organization. So it definitely takes that soft skill part and the ability to be able to talk across different silos within organizations. But talk to me about the strength of that soft skill. Because I feel like some people feel like, okay, I went to IAPP, I got a certification, I got this degree, and then, I'm going to be the best privacy, whatever, whether that's a data officer or a privacy officer or data protection officer. But some people, they don't know how to talk to people in different areas and they don't know how to get their trust and their buy-in. And without that, you will not succeed. But tell me your thoughts.
It's a brilliant comment, Debbie. And it actually relates back much to your contribution in the book, getting buy-in from senior leadership teams. How do you do that? I've heard this question being asked so many times. I have everything that I need. I have all my qualifications. I've got everything. How do I do that? And what that executive presence, what does it look like? How do I establish it? They're not easy skills. It's much easier to learn the subject matter expertise than it is to learn how to behave during a data breach, how to keep the team going during a crisis. The skills that are required are not specific to privacy. They're much, much wider and much, much broader. I would say to everybody, go do a master's in leadership, go do an MBA, go do something that's going to give you an outlet to practice those skills and learn those skills if you can't learn them on the job. They're so important. How to speak to senior executives. I had a very early experience many, many years ago when I was working in the bank. My first time speaking to the board was about an email system that I wanted to introduce that the board wanted to hear about. And my then boss, who was very, very good to me, mentored me and said, just keep it baby language, just baby language. No fancy words, nothing fancy, just baby language. And I started off by saying, I wanted to discuss the complexity of the information assets in the organization. And down the table, I saw him put his head in his hands. And I knew that meant I'd gone wrong already. I had literally not even finished my first sentence. And then I changed course and I just said, okay, I'm going to use baby words here. But actually, I've learned, over the years, it's not about the words, it's about brevity. It's about knowing exactly what it is they're interested in. They're interested in profit. They're interested in share value. They're not interested in the tiny minutiae of why a machine didn't work. And so it's brevity, bullet points, knowing exactly what those bullet points are before you go into the room. And knowing your bullet points always, because you could have an opportunity for that elevator pitch in the lift at any point in time when you meet someone on that team. You need to be prepared for that one bullet point, what we're doing this year, what's important to the privacy team this year, what is the biggest challenge we face this year. Just one bullet point that you always have in your head. Go through the soft skills as I see them in the book, and I analyze each one. We talked to an awful lot of people when we were creating the book about what those skills were that they thought they had, or the skills that they felt were missing in a lot of leaders. And so the idea is it's a compendium of behaviors that we should see in leaders, and no one is going to have all of them. But you can look at the compendium and say, I'm actually not doing too bad. I've got, let's say, 75% of these qualities. These are the ones, obviously, that I need to work on. So you can see from the compendium of these skills where your areas to develop are.
I love that. I love that. I love to talk to executives who've been in corporations or working with corporations for many years because you can hear the maturity and the learning there. I agree very much. You definitely have to figure out the motivation. What motivates the people that you're talking about? What are they most interested in? I used to say it's very important. So if you're going into a meeting with the board, think about what they want. Think about what they want to hear and be able to try to make sure that your message resonates with them. The best way to alienate the person that you're talking to, especially if they're not a privacy person or legal person, the last thing they want you to do is spout out article numbers and talk about GDPR and different acronyms. That's like the worst that you could possibly ever do.
That is so true.
I always say you have to be able to, especially in privacy, because it's a human issue, you have to be able to talk to someone who's 80 or 8. So when I'm talking with people, I try to make it as simple as possible and try to think about it around the things that people care about. I had an example, a specific example I want to give you about this. I was talking to a lawyer about some system that we wanted to do, and this person was not wanting to go along with the suggestion. And I realized that this person, they worked tons of hours, they had young children and stuff like that. And I said, do you want to go home at 5 o'clock? And that resonated with her. And I'm like, okay, if we do this way, you won't have to work 12 hours a day. We have to do something different. So being able to find those things are of interest, things that will resonate with the person you're talking to, will really help you get that buy-in.
Such a good example as well. Just finding there was a great book called Change or Die, and that was the guy who wrote the book said that the only way to create the change was to figure out what people's keys were, to find their key, the key to change for them. And everybody's key is different. So you're right, find their key.
Excellent. I want to talk to you a little bit about the EU. You're included in the EDPB's expert pool for privacy. And I know the AI Act isn't directly privacy, quote unquote, but in a way it is because so much of the data that we're dealing with is of humans. And so that raises the risk in privacy. So to me, those things are connected. But give me your idea about what you think the impact of the EU Privacy Act will be. Before you answer that question, as someone who's seen the GDPR, when the GDPR first passed in May of 2016, I thought that I would wake up May 25th, 2016. The people in the US would just care about privacy. This is the thing I've been working on for many years and nothing. There were no articles. There was nothing in the paper. No one talked anything about it or whatever. And I was crestfallen. I thought, this is so important. This is going to change so much of what we're doing. So 2 years later, once it actually went into enforcement, then you started to hear people in the US talk about it. And since then, we've seen how influential GDPR has been across different jurisdictions around the world. So, with that backdrop in mind, and you sort of at the center of what's happening in the EU with AI being the first jurisdiction in the world to have comprehensive regulation featuring AI, what do you think is going to be the impact globally?
I don't think it's going to be like GDPR. So I don't think it's going to have that same impact. But I think that we actually don't really know yet because we know that this piece of legislation was produced very, very quickly. It doesn't mean that it's not a robust piece of legislation. It is a good piece of legislation. A huge number of people invested time into getting it across the line quickly. But I think that rather than the legislation, it's the other piece. It's actually the AI. We don't know where that's going and we don't know how it's going to take off. And I'm not too sure that the legislation knows where it's going to be in 5 years' time. GDPR knew that it was dealing with personal data and what was going to happen with it, but it didn't know about AI in the way that it does today, which necessitated an additional component, which is the AI Act. I don't think the AI Act knows what lies ahead because of AI. Oh, I mean, we can say, well, we know there's going to be problems with training data and with copyright and with creator sort of patents. And there's so many issues that lie in the AI space. But we didn't know when Twitter started how addictive likes would be. We didn't know when Facebook started that it could be used for bullying. We didn't know these things when those social media apps started. That became apparent as the actual apps evolved. And so now we find ourselves, I think AI Act is only going to address the birth of the AI world, but I don't think it's going to be able to cope with the teenager, if you want to call it that. I just wonder whether the process that we take, which is we watch, we observe, we see the issues, we create legislation that takes years to come to fore, and then we watch and we see, and then we create it. But we're always firefighting, we're always behind the issues and the problems, and then we're trying to create solutions through legislation. And I don't know whether that's the right way forward as data becomes so big. I think maybe we have to radically rethink how we approach protecting privacy. And by that I mean like thinking about sort of federated identities and things like that. And that will only fix the personal data piece of AI. There's lots of AI stuff that's not related to personal data. But that would be my view on our approach. I think the AI Act is necessary. I actually think it's vital right now. I'm delighted that we have it. Does it mean more work for privacy professionals? Absolutely. But does it mean enormous amounts of work? Not if you were good, if you know what I mean. If you had all your boxes ticked and you were already addressing the ethical components, the fairness components, the transparency components, the necessity and proportionality principles. If you were already good in that space, I think you're going to be okay with AI. But I think if you're weak in that space, and if you had a lot of leverage, then you're going to find a lot of work needs to be done with the AI regulation for your organization. I think it's back to the same thing as we were with GDPR, which was there was an awful lot of organizations were not compliant with the directive. They had a huge jump to make to become compliant with GDPR. And so they complained that it was such a big job, but actually they should have been already so much better with the directive because it had no stick to beat them with. They never bothered. And I think that may be the same, that with AI, they've been compliant, the ethical component, not been very good with that space. And the AI regulation may move in and sort of become more robust in that space. But we've yet to see. We have to wait.
I agree with that. I love that point of view. When I think about AI, the blind spots that I see or the weak areas that I see, and I agree with you, companies that are very good and robust in these other areas, they can add on the considerations for AI and probably not miss much of a step, right? They're just adding on, they're building on their sound foundation. But companies that haven't done that, it'll be a heavier lift within their organizations. But when I think of AI, I think about two things that, let's say, companies who aren't ready to handle what the AI Act or different AI legislations have come into force, and that is the data governance area and the data lineage. So a lot of what AI calls for is this level of transparency in how data is being handled of individuals, and a lot of that stems from the lineage of data. What is the data that you have? Where did it come from? Why are you using it? How are you using it? And to me, part of that task lives or will live or sits in governance within the organization, but it will have to be broader because before governance was like, we don't care where the data came from, but this is what happens to it when I get it or whatever. Thinking an AI point of view, you have to know part of knowing that governance is understanding where did the data come from? Do I have the right to consent? Do I have the legal right to use this data? Even if I have the right to use this data in one sense, can I use it in this different other way? What are your thoughts?
I think that there's a monster of complications when it comes to AI. It's not straightforward. So, training data, for instance, that's a monster. Is my data going to be used for training data? In fact, it probably already has been. And how do I say no now that it's already in there? A very difficult thing to do. How do I know what the AI is creating in terms of information about me? AI is a wonderful thing. I'm the positivist. So I always come at these things from what are the amazing ways that it can be used, then prudence in how we do that, rather than let's all be scared about AI, because obviously there are some scary things. But if we were to take the scary approach, we'd have never gone beyond candles towards electricity. It does represent progress. I think that for me, the big issue when I think about my own personal data with AI is the knowledge of what it's creating. Microsoft have created tools that can detect early onset Parkinson's through your mouse movements using AI. Now, that is incredibly powerful. But what else can they infer? So it's this space of inference that I find almost disturbing. I'm a wow factor with it as well. I move between two spaces where I go, wow, that's incredible, but also, wow, that's really a little bit invasive. My mouse movements and getting early onset Alzheimer's, and they can do it to the same accuracy as the medical tests. They can also do early onset Parkinson's. So there's so many different things that are positive. You can see straight away the invasiveness in the inference. And it's the inference that AI is capable of is far greater than any inference a human being could ever make. Because it's a pattern matcher. It can match patterns. And so what does AI know about us? I can't make a subject access request if I don't know that you've created that information about me. Traditionally, I've known what information you have because I actually gave it to you. I know you have my name and address because I gave it to you. I know you have my name and address because you send me something. But what do governments know about us through inference? What do large corporations know about us through inference? And it's this capacity to create inference that I feel very uncomfortable about. And I'm not too sure the AI regulation is going to fix that. And I think that in this space, we're going to see many breaches of legislation is in the inference space. We have tiny little nuggets happening all the time. We saw a really interesting court case not related to AI in Lithuania, where a Lithuanian woman said the records being kept by the government and demanded by her government for her spouse's name were sensitive, not normal personal data. They were sensitive personal data because her name was Louise and her spouse's name is Mary. Therefore, you know that my orientation, my sexual orientation is homosexual. And so they weren't using the right legal basis. There was a lot of complications, and that's not including AI, but that's an inferential piece of data that they hadn't considered. Some argue, which is fair, well, it also has always inferred heterosexuality, but we never thought about it. You know, the heterosexuality was always inferred by your spouse's name, but we just never thought about it before. And I thought that was an interesting comment. I was at a workshop and somebody made this comment. I thought it was an interesting one, which is true. These governments have had our spouses' names, so they've been able to infer heterosexuality for many, many years. It's just now that marriage is allowed for everybody, they can infer homosexuality. And so I suppose the minority element, we have to be careful. But that's where I see the most dangerous space in the AI right now, in the bit that we know. I know there's a bit that we don't know. None of us can anticipate what that sort of the next 5 years looks like.
Wow. I agree with that. I actually did a video a couple years ago about inference. And so that is the problem because, like you said, this is not something you gave someone. It's something that they connected the dots about, and they may use that in some way that could possibly be harmful, which is a challenge. So, if it were the world, according to you, Dr. Valerie, and we did everything that you said, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world, whether that be regulation, human behavior, or something in technology?
I personally think there's a massive disparity in terms of privacy across the world. And I'm not just talking about the US versus the EU versus, Eurasia. I think privacy has become almost a commodity of the wealthy states and nations. I'd like to see privacy become a more social expectation that people are entitled to privacy. We do have privacy as a right, but it's a different thing to data protection. So I'd like to see all the countries, I don't expect them to have robust data protection, but certainly I know, for instance, that markets in Africa, you'll find that iPhone doesn't have the same market in Africa as other phones because they're cheaper. So therefore, it's like the data of the poor is leveraged. And that I'd like to see change. I don't see much motivation to make that change. I suppose we've got bigger fish to fry in a lot of ways. Obviously, I think it goes without saying, Debbie, everybody would like to see a federal privacy law. We can bang that one to death, but it would be nice. It would be fantastic for professionals in the US to just have one piece of legislation that is harmonized across the states. I think it would be great to have that. There's also other laws. I think, for instance, you've got the Illinois Biometric Act. There's an awful lot of talk about Europe saying, oh, well, the US should take those European laws. And I think there's US laws we should be looking at and saying that's a really fantastic law. And we should look at that law at expanding it because I do think it's a really robust piece of legislation. I think the world would be an awful lot easier if our legislations across the world were much more similar. They don't have to be exactly the same, but if they were much more similar. And then that, particularly, I think in the US, I think data subject rights need to be stronger. And I hear a constant diatribe about, the cost of data subject rights and delivering data subject rights, etc., being high cost in capitalist organizations. And I get that. That's actually the cost of processing data. You just happen to be getting it cheap, is my argument. And so I'd like to see that change. I think the ethical approach, privacy as a CSO, it's becoming more and more important. I've seen the research show that over the last 10 years, privacy as a CSO was only being spoken about and discussed in CSO reports in the large tech companies way back 10 years ago. Now it's pretty much the Fortune 500. They're all talking about privacy. So we're seeing it go in the right direction. It would be my Santa list.
That's a great Santa list. I agree. I co-sign your Santa list. I agree with that as well. Well, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for doing this from Dublin. I really appreciate your point of view, and I really appreciate the mark that you're putting on the privacy industry. We need more people like you who are really willing to share your knowledge and wealth of information with all of us, because I think we learn so much from one another, and I think that you're really ahead of the game in terms of leading and showing that your leadership in that area.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I much appreciate it. And thank you for your wonderful podcast as well.
Yeah.
It is my favorite. So
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Well, we'll talk soon. I really appreciate the talk today. This is fantastic.
thank you so much, Debbie.